That Saturday night remains one of the most intense and unforgettable experiences of my life. It was an ordinary weekend evening, seemingly calm, but I could sense something brewing beneath the surface, a tension waiting to snap. It wasn't just the fun I was having with my best friend Chris. It was something more profound, a palpable energy in the air that heightened everything, making me feel intensely alive. Chris and I had been inseparable since childhood, spending countless weekends together, immersed in video games and endless conversations. There was nothing romantic between us, not outwardly, but a subtle, undefined connection always lingered, a spark waiting to ignite. We were at his place, his parents out for the night, leaving us with the house to ourselves. The evening began typically enough: pizza, video games, and easy banter. But as the hours passed, the atmosphere shifted. The laughter quieted, the silences lengthened, and we found ourselves sitting in the darkened living room, the TV a background hum, lost in our own thoughts. "I can't believe we're graduating soon," Chris said, breaking the silence, his voice soft, almost melancholic. "Yeah," I replied, unsure of what else to say. Graduation felt both distant and imminent, approaching faster than either of us wanted to admit. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "You ever think about what happens next?" I shrugged. "Not really. I guess we'll figure it out." Chris remained silent for a moment, his gaze shifting between me and the TV. The silence grew heavy, laden with unspoken words. "You know," he said quietly, "things are going to change." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "After we graduate," he continued, still not meeting my eye, "we're not going to be around each other as much. Things won't be the same." His words struck me hard. I hadn't truly considered it before, but he was right. After high school, everything would be different. We wouldn't have this easy camaraderie, these effortless weekends together. "Yeah," I said softly, "I guess you're right." We lapsed back into silence, but this time it felt different, weighted with an unspoken understanding neither of us wanted to confront. The tension intensified, the unspoken words growing louder with each passing second. Without thinking, I shifted closer to him on the couch. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but it felt significant. Chris glanced at me, our eyes locking briefly before he quickly looked away. "You ever think about what it would be like if things were different?" His voice was so low I almost missed it. My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," he said, trying for a casual tone, but there was an underlying intensity. "Like if we didn't have to follow the rules, if we didn't have to worry about what everyone else thinks." I struggled to process his words. There had always been an unspoken connection between us, simmering beneath the surface. Now it felt like he was bringing it into the open. "Yeah," I whispered, "I guess I've thought about that." Chris didn't respond, but the tension between us escalated, like a tightly wound spring. My heart pounded in my chest. Everything felt precarious, balanced on the edge of something I couldn't grasp. Then, without warning, he leaned closer, his shoulder brushing against mine. The touch was feather-light, yet it sent a shockwave through me. I held my breath, anticipating his next move, unsure whether to speak, act, or simply let the moment pass. But it didn't pass. Chris moved closer still, our knees touching, and I felt the warmth radiating from him. My mind raced, my heart pounded. I'd never considered this possibility, but now that it was happening, the flood of thoughts was overwhelming. Before I could speak, Chris's voice, barely a whisper, broke the silence. "You ever wonder what it'd be like?" "What would be like?" I asked, my throat suddenly dry. "To not hold back," he said, glancing at me fleetingly before looking away again. "To just do what feels right." The air between us crackled with unspoken desire. I didn't know what to say or do, but I felt something powerful building between us, something long dormant, finally waiting to emerge. But the story didn't end there. Chris leaned in, his face inches from mine, his breath warm against my skin. It was subtle, a mere shift in the air, but enough to send my heart racing. My mind screamed at me to pull away, to say something, anything, to break the tension. But my body remained unresponsive, frozen in the gravity of the moment. I couldn't think clearly, couldn't move. And then, just like that, everything shifted. The next day felt different. The air around Chris and me was thicker, charged with an unspoken energy. We didn't discuss what had transpired, yet we both acknowledged the undeniable change. There was no going back, and the weight of that realization pressed down on me as I got ready to meet him. It was our usual routine, meeting at the local basketball court, a place filled with shared memories of countless afternoons spent shooting hoops and joking around. But today, the familiar felt foreign. After last night, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had shifted. When I arrived, Chris was already there, idly dribbling a basketball. He looked up as I approached, and for a fleeting second, I saw something new in his eyes, a flicker of something that hadn't been there before. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, but it was enough to make my heart race. "Hey," he said casually, as if nothing had changed, as if we hadn't spent the previous night teetering on the precipice of something irreversible. "Hey," I replied, my throat dry. We stood there for a moment, the only sound the rhythmic bounce of the basketball. I wanted to break the tension, but the words caught in my throat. Everything felt delicate, as if one wrong word could shatter the fragile peace. "You want to play?" Chris asked, tossing me the ball. I caught it, the familiar weight momentarily grounding me. "Sure," I said, though my heart wasn't in it. We played, falling into the familiar rhythm of the game, but the tension lingered in the spaces between our movements, in the fleeting eye contact, and the strained silences that followed every comment. After a while, Chris called a break. We leaned against the chain-link fence, wiping the sweat from our foreheads, my mind still racing. "So," he began after a long pause, his voice quiet. "Last night?" My heart skipped a beat. I'd hoped we could avoid the conversation, pretend nothing had happened. But deep down, I knew it was impossible. "Yeah," I said, unsure how to proceed. Chris was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the ground. Did it feel weird to you?" I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "What about you?" He shrugged, still avoiding my eyes. We've been friends for so long, and now..." His voice trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished, but I understood. "Yeah," I repeated because I didn't know what else to say. My heart raced, my mind a whirlwind of confusing thoughts. Everything had changed, and I felt lost. Finally, Chris spoke again, his voice barely audible. "Do you think we can just go back to how things were?" I looked at him, my heart sinking. "I don't know." He nodded, his gaze still on the ground. "Yeah, me neither." We stood there for a long time. I wanted to reassure him, to tell him everything would be okay, but I didn't know if it would be. I didn't know if we could go back, and the uncertainty terrified me. By the time we parted ways, I was emotionally and physically drained. I walked home, my mind replaying everything. I couldn't stop thinking about Chris, about the shift in our relationship, about what it all meant. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the events of the day played on repeat in my mind. I felt like I was losing control, teetering on the edge of something I didn't understand. Just as I was drifting off, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Chris. "Are you awake?" My heart skipped a beat. I hesitated before replying. "Yeah." There was a long pause before his next message arrived. "Can we talk?" My pulse quickened. I wasn't sure I was ready, but I knew avoiding the conversation wouldn't help. "Sure," I replied. "What's up?" The 3 dots appeared, indicating he was typing. I held my breath. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened last night." I swallowed hard, my fingers trembling as I typed, "Me too." Another long pause. "Do you regret it?" I hadn't considered it in those terms. Did I regret it? I wasn't sure. Everything was so confusing, a tangled mess of emotions I couldn't unravel. After a long silence, I replied, "I don't know. Do you?" The pause this time was even longer. My heart raced, my hands shook as I waited. "No." I stared at the screen, my mind reeling. My heart pounded, a frantic drum against my ribs. This wasn't what I'd anticipated. I couldn't even say what I had anticipated, but it wasn't this. My pulse hammered, a chaotic rhythm echoing the turmoil in my gut. I couldn't name the emotions swirling within me. Before I could react, another message arrived. I think I want to figure this out together." I froze, my heart a captive bird fluttering against its cage. His words hung in the air, their meaning unclear. Did he want to dissect what happened? Or did he mean something more? The frantic race of my heart at the mere thought gave me my answer. After a moment, I typed back, "Yeah, me too." A long silence followed. I wondered if the conversation had ended. Just as I was about to lower my phone, another message appeared. "Do you want to come over tomorrow? We can talk about it in person." My heart stuttered. The prospect of seeing him again, of confronting everything face to face, sent a shiver of nervous anticipation through me. Avoiding it wasn't an option. If we were going to untangle this, we needed to talk. "Yeah, I'll be there." The next day, I found myself outside his house, my heart hammering against my chest. I hadn't felt this nervous around Chris in years. Everything felt different now. The air between us was charged, the familiar comfort replaced with an unsettling tension. I had no idea what awaited me on the other side of that door. He opened it before I could knock, as if he'd been waiting. Our eyes met, and for a beat, neither of us spoke. The silence crackled with unspoken words, heavy with anticipation. My pulse quickened. We went to the living room, sitting on the same couch where everything had begun just days ago. The silence wasn't awkward. It was pregnant with meaning, with something I couldn't quite grasp. Chris spoke first, his voice low and steady. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about what happened." I nodded, unable to trust my voice. "I don't know what this is," he continued, his gaze holding mine. "But I know I don't want to lose what we have. I don't want to lose you." His words washed over me, leaving me breathless. I'd been so consumed by confusion and fear that I hadn't considered what this might mean for us, for our friendship. Now, hearing him say it, I realized I felt the same. "I don't want to lose you either," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Silence fell again, but this time it felt different. Something hung in the air between us, unspoken but undeniable. As we sat there, side by side, I knew that whatever happened next, there was no going back. The moment I stepped into Chris's room, the air grew thick, heavy with unspoken words. My heart pounded, a frantic rhythm in my ears. I knew whatever was about to happen would irrevocably change everything. It wasn't just about the conversation anymore. We'd crossed a line, and there was no retreat. Chris closed the door behind me, his movements quiet and deliberate. We hadn't spoken much since I arrived, but words were unnecessary. The way his eyes held mine, the way he hovered just a few feet away, spoke volumes. We were thinking the same thing. It was inevitable. He sat on the edge of his bed, the familiar creak of the mattress breaking the silence. I stood there, my back against the door, my pulse racing. I tried to gather my thoughts, but my mind was a chaotic swirl of emotions and desires. I hadn't wanted to confront this, not like this, but here we were, and there was no turning back. "Do you ever wonder?" Chris's voice was soft, hesitant, yet it cut through the thick air like a knife. "What if this is something we don't have to ignore?" I blinked, unsure how to respond. My mouth was dry, my hands trembling slightly as I pushed off the door and took a few steps forward. The room felt smaller now, the space between us shrinking with each step. My heart beat faster with each inch I closed. "Yeah," I managed, my voice barely a whisper. I wasn't sure if it was the truth or just what I thought I should say. He smiled, but it wasn't his usual carefree grin. This smile was different, nervous, uncertain. "I've been thinking about it a lot, more than I probably should." I swallowed, the tension between us thickening. We stood at the precipice of something I couldn't fully comprehend, something that both terrified and exhilarated me. Looking into his eyes, I knew I wasn't alone in feeling this way. I moved closer, finally sitting beside him. We were so close I could feel the warmth radiating from him, but neither of us dared to touch. Not yet. The silence stretched, its weight pressing down on us. Every second felt like an eternity, each breath shallow and uncertain. But now, sitting together in the quiet of his room, there was no denying it. Chris leaned in, his movement slow and deliberate, as if giving me a final chance to pull away. I didn't. I couldn't. I closed the distance between us, our lips meeting in a kiss that felt like years in the making. It wasn't just a kiss. It was everything. The tension, the confusion, the fear, all melting away in that single moment of connection. It was soft at first, hesitant, as if we were both unsure. Then something shifted, and the kiss deepened. My heart raced, my mind spinning as I lost myself in the moment. The rest of the world faded away, leaving only the two of us. Locked in that instant, a moment I knew would alter everything, Chris's hand grazed my face, his touch gentle as the kiss deepened. My body reacted in unexpected ways, my pulse racing with the escalating heat between us. Hesitation vanished, replaced by certainty. This was real and unstoppable. Our breaths mingled, heavy in the small space between us. When we finally broke away, breathless and flushed, we both knew it wasn't the end, but a beginning. I tried to speak, but words failed me. How could I articulate the intensity of my feelings, the depth of my desires? It was overwhelming. Chris remained silent too, instead leaning in, his lips finding mine with a desperation that mirrored my own. This time, there was no doubt, no holding back. It was fast, yet time seemed to slow, each touch, each breath deliberate, as if we were both acutely aware, yet powerless to resist. There was no turning back, no denying the reality of it. We parted again, foreheads touching, catching our breath. The air crackled with an electric charge. I knew I'd never forget this moment, this night. "I've wanted this for so long," Chris whispered, his voice low and husky, sending shivers down my spine. I just didn't know how to say it. Closing my eyes, my heart pounding, I barely managed. "Me too." "I didn't think you felt the same," he said, pulling back slightly, searching my eyes. How could I not? The question hung in the air. My mind reeled, trying to process the weight of everything that had transpired. There was no denying it any longer. This was real. Whatever it was, whatever we were, it was real. It felt natural, like something dormant, waiting for the right moment to surface. Now that it had, there was no going back. I knew Chris felt it too, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. We remained intertwined for what seemed like hours, our kisses growing more fervent, more urgent. Words were unnecessary. Our bodies, our racing hearts, spoke volumes. Eventually, we pulled apart, breathless and flushed, the weight of the moment settling over us. I saw the same mixture of fear, excitement, and uncertainty reflected in Chris's eyes, but beneath it all, something profound. "I don't want this to be a mistake," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It's not," Chris replied, taking my hand. "It's not a mistake." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe it was more than a moment of vulnerability, more than confusion or curiosity, but I struggled to comprehend it all. "I'm scared," I confessed, my voice shaking. Chris squeezed my hand, his gaze unwavering. "Me too." We sat in the quiet of his room, the weight of everything hanging in the air. There were no easy answers, no way to make sense of it, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone, and that was something. We stayed there for a long while, the silence comfortable now, the tension easing. So much remained unsaid, so much we didn't understand, but in that moment, it didn't matter. We had each other, and that was enough. The room was still, but everything felt different. We sat in the quiet aftermath of something that had fundamentally shifted our friendship. Neither of us spoke for a while, the silence stretching between us. But this time, it wasn't awkward. It was a silence filled with unspoken words, with everything we hadn't been able to articulate before. Chris leaned back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. I felt the weight of his presence beside me, the gravity that had drawn us together still palpable. It was strange how quickly things had changed. We had spent years side by side, but tonight had turned everything upside down. "I didn't expect this," I finally said, breaking the silence, my voice still uncertain as I tried to process it all. Chris didn't look at me, but I saw a small smile play on his lips. "Neither did I," he admitted. "But now that it's happened, I don't know. It feels like it was supposed to. Does this change everything? I asked, my heart pounding again. The intimacy we shared had shifted things, but I wasn't sure if it would last, if it even could. He finally turned to meet my gaze, his eyes soft but serious. I don't think it changes. Everything he said, deliberate and slow, changed us. And perhaps that wasn't a bad thing at all. His words lingered, suspended in the air, and a strange tranquility washed over me. Maybe he was right. Maybe this change wasn't something to dread, but something to embrace, to lean into. After all, we'd always been close. Perhaps this was simply a new chapter unfolding in our shared narrative. I lay back next to him, the cool air a gentle caress against my skin, and gazed up at the ceiling. "So, where do we go from here?" I asked. Chris chuckled softly, the sound a welcome lightness in the room. "I guess we figure it out along the way." He was right, wasn't he? There was no roadmap for this, no clearly marked path forward. Yet, in a way, that was liberating. Unburdened by expectations or prescribed rules, we could shape this into whatever we desired. "I guess that's all we can do," I replied, feeling the tightness in my chest begin to dissolve. We lay there for what seemed like hours, conversing about everything and nothing. The words flowed easily between us, as they always had, but now there was an added depth, an unspoken understanding. We didn't need to define it, but we both recognized the shift, a shift for the better. After a while, Chris sat up, glancing at the clock. "It's late," he observed, running a hand through his hair. "Want to stay over?" I hesitated for a moment, not because I didn't want to stay, but because I was uncertain what staying implied now. We had crossed a threshold, an irreversible one, and part of me worried that spending the night might further complicate things. But then, perhaps complicating things wasn't so bad anymore. "Yeah," I said, sitting up beside him. "I'll stay." Chris smiled, and for the first time in what felt like forever, everything felt easy. We rose and moved about the room in a comfortable, familiar rhythm as we prepared for bed. The silence was no longer empty, but filled with a newfound understanding. There were no awkward glances, no lingering tension, just a quiet comfort in knowing we were navigating this together. I climbed into bed, pulling the blanket over me, and Chris lay down beside me. It wasn't the first time we'd shared a bed, but now it felt different. Not awkward, not strained, just new, as though we had stepped into a previously undiscovered territory of our friendship. We lay there in the darkness, enveloped by the quiet hum of the night, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. It wasn't a perfect resolution, not some grand epiphany, but it was enough. Enough to know we weren't alone in this. Enough to know that whatever came next, we would face it together. I closed my eyes, my mind finally still as sleep beckoned. But before I drifted off, I heard Chris's voice, soft in the darkness. "Hey," he whispered. "Yeah?" I mumbled, half asleep. "I'm glad it was you," he said, his words a quiet reassurance. A soft smile touched my lips, my eyes still closed. "I'm glad too," I whispered back, my voice barely audible in the darkness. As sleep claimed me, the future felt distant, and what mattered most was that we had faced this moment together. That was enough, for now. I never imagined things would change between us, but after that night, everything was different. And while the future remains uncertain, one thing is clear. We've crossed a line, a point of no return. But maybe, just maybe, this is where we were always meant to be.